headlines, Korea details new taxes on large corporate cash reserves as it tries to channel corporate money into higher wages and dividends to boost growth. Samsung Electronics and Apple call a truce and agree to drop all patent lawsuits outside of the U.S. market. And the World Health Organization is set to discuss whether to call the latest Ebola outbreak a public health emergency of international concern and inject its resources to help contain it. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in. The Korean government's announced new taxes on large corporate cash reserves. This is mainly to put that cash to work in driving economic activity in this economy that saw its weakest pace of growth in over a year in the second quarter. Ji Myung-gil has more.
The Park Geun-hye administration is proposing a tax revision, putting pressure on large conglomerates to use their cash reserves on investments, paying out dividends, and raising the wages of their employees. Instead of hoarding that cash, the government would like to see it flow into households as a way to boost domestic consumption. Under the government's proposal for a tax revision that goes into effect next year, the government will provide a 5 to 10% tax deduction for companies that raise employee salaries with extra incentives for firms that take additional measures. The dividend tax will be cut to 9% from the current 14% if dividend payouts meet certain targets. The government will impose a 10% tax on the portions of cash reserves that are deemed excessive.
We hope the companies spend their net profits on investment, salaries, and dividends.
The idea of taxing the internal reserves of companies has not been met with kindly by the business community. They contend that many of the businesses have been setting aside earnings for a rainy day. Even if companies increase their dividends to avoid taxes on their cash reserves, they say the impact would not meet expectations for increasing domestic investment and consumption. Ji Myung-gil, ARIRANG News.
Another downgrade on Korea's 2014 growth forecast. The Korea Institute of Finance projects the Korean economy to grow 3.9%, which is 0.2 percentage lower than its last one. The think tank cited a slower than expected recovery stemming from a slow pickup in the U.S. and China. Korea's slow domestic demand following April's ferry disaster was another culprit. The KIF also changed its stance and called for further monetary easing this time, saying the sentiment needs to be managed as well. The Bank of Korea holds its rate meeting next Thursday. After 3 years of patent battle raged around the world, Samsung Electronics and Apple appear to be laying down their weapons for now. The smartphone rivals have agreed to drop all legal battles against each other except for those in the U.S. Park Ji-won has the details.
Samsung and Apple agreed to drop all litigation cases between them in all countries, except for in the United States. That means some 30 lawsuits will be dropped in courts in 8 countries, including Korea, Japan, Germany, and France. However, the joint statement released Wednesday says the agreement does not cover any cross-licensing arrangements between the two smartphone rivals. The lawsuits between the world's 2 biggest smartphone makers began in 2011 when Apple sued Samsung for copying iPhone features. Samsung responded by countersuing Apple for infringing its wireless transmission technology. The patent trials have since spread to courts around the globe. The mutual rapprochement began in May when Samsung and Apple agreed to drop lawsuits related to Motorola mobility. 1 month later, they agreed to dismiss their appeals of a patent case at the U.S. International Trade Commission. This week's agreement leaves just 2 cases pending in the U.S., both currently in the appeals process. In May, a jury ordered Samsung to pay Apple some $120 million in damages. It also ordered Apple to pay some $160,000 to Samsung for patent infringements. In a separate case in a U.S. court in 2012, a jury verdict ordered Samsung to pay Apple $930 million. Both cases are currently being appealed. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
The recent slowdown of exports to China is setting off alarms for trade officials in South Korea, as China is its largest trading partner. But some analysts say the crisis could actually serve as an opportunity for some. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
The rate of increase in Korea's exports to China is slowing as local Chinese companies are producing cheaper products. Up until now, a majority of Korean exports to China were in the form of intermediate trade, goods in which the product is reprocessed and consumed in the import country. Steel, machinery, and petrochemicals fall in that category, and it's why analysts like Lee Bong-gol from the Korea International Trade Association have emphasized the need to diversify the country's exports, to shift the focus toward consumer goods or products that can be purchased for use by the average Chinese consumer.
We have to look closely into the recent growth policies and paradigm shifts made by the Chinese government. In the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008, Beijing is trying to develop its domestic market to boost consumption rather than becoming a big factory for exports.
027 Incorporated, a Korean clothing manufacturer for toddlers, is an example of one company that's taking advantage of Beijing's growth policies. It has sales of around $236 million last year and is currently doing business with more than 200 stores across China.
We expect the demand for baby products to increase in China as the government gradually relaxes its one-child policy.
Consumer goods to China from January to May this year increased more than 9% compared to the same period last year, promising signs for Korean industries who are trying to survive in the increasingly competitive global market. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
For the latest in news that impacts Korea and the world, join Kang Chae-ri for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on ARIRANG TV.
Human Rights Council headquarters in Geneva on Thursday, finding ways to persuade. Following a few bullying scandals of Korean soldiers in recent months, the Army is launching a special task force on reforming Korea's military culture. The Army says the task force will consist of officers, government officials, and civilian experts who will come up with a plan to combat bullying in the military by the end of this year. This initiative comes after a 22-year-old Army sergeant who was bullied, opened fire, and killed 5 of his comrades in June. And just last week, it was revealed that a 23-year-old Army private who was also allegedly bullied by members of his military unit was beaten to death in April. North Korea's conventional weapons may be falling in the hands of Islamist terrorist groups, according to U.S.-based website 38 North. It raised that possibility this week, saying Pyongyang seems to be using Iran as a logistical link in the chain, as it has a historical and possibly continuing arms relationship with non-state actors in the Middle East, namely Hamas and Hezbollah. British daily The Telegraph has also reported that Hamas is negotiating a new arms deal with North Korea. Weapons the two groups could buy from North Korea include AK-47s and ammunition, artillery shells, rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank missiles, and surface-to-surface missiles. The UN Security Council has issued a fresh warning to North Korea. It said more ballistic missile tests will be met with harsh consequences. In a meeting Tuesday, Council members denounced the regime's recent launches and reminded Pyongyang that they were in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. The Council did not specify the measures that would be taken, but they did raise the possibility of further sanctions if North Korea continues to flout its international commitments. North Korea has test-fired short-range ballistic missiles on 7 different occasions so far this year. The U.S. State Department has said many times in the past that Japan's wartime sexual slavery is a serious violation of human rights. But now, Washington wants Tokyo to accept historical facts and take responsibility. Our Shin Se-min has the details.
The United States is urging Japan to resolve the issue of its wartime system of sex slavery and take responsibility for its past atrocities.
We encourage Japan to continue to address this issue in a manner that promotes healing and facilitates better relations with neighboring states.
The State Department confirmed a report on Tuesday that White House and State Department representatives held closed-door interviews with Lee Hyuk-sun and Kang Il-chul, two Korean victims of Japan's sex slavery system, to discuss their experiences. Emphasizing that it wasn't the first face-to-face meeting between the women and U.S. officials, the spokesperson said Washington was open to holding similar meetings again in the future.
It is deplorable and clearly a grave human rights violation of enormous proportions that the Japanese military was involved in the trafficking of women for sexual purposes in the 1930s and 1940s.
Citing a spokesman at the U.S. National Safety Council, Korea's Yonhap News Agency also reports the two women met with the officials from the White House Office of Public Engagement. However, the names of the officials who met with the women have not been disclosed. Lee Hyuk-sun and Kang Il-chul are currently traveling around the U.S., taking part in memorial events remembering the victims of Japan's historical wrongdoings. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Sunavi Pillay sternly criticized Japan's approach to the issue of its wartime sexual slavery. She said in a statement on Wednesday that the human rights of its victims have been infringed even now, decades after the end of the Second World War. Pillay also urged Japan to resolve this issue from a comprehensive and impartial approach. The Korean government, meanwhile, also urged Japan to take sincere reflection and responsible measures to resolve this issue. With the Ebola outbreak sweeping the headlines in recent days, concerns that infectious diseases could spread to other parts of the world are on the rise. Our Kwon So-hwa gives us a rundown of which diseases to watch out for before embarking on a trip.
No matter how slim you think your chances are of contracting a dangerous disease, prevention is always better than having to rely on a cure, especially as the world becomes smaller and people travel more. But even those who never leave the country can pick up something nasty, as there are more and more people catching contagious diseases in Korea. In fact, according to the Ministry of Health and Welfare, the number of measles patients this year stood at 410 as of the middle of last month. That's nearly 4 times more than the number recorded over the whole of last year. What's noteworthy is that only 14 of the 410 patients came down with measles abroad. Over 350 cases, the vast majority, caught it as a secondary infection in Korea. This is why taking the required vaccinations and medicine is so important. The most serious and contagious diseases are commonly found in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. The yellow fever vaccination is mandatory when traveling to any country affected by the viral disease, while all the others on the list are recommended. Malaria, for example, which is mainly transmitted by mosquitoes, can be prevented by taking anti-malaria tablets before, during, and after trips to affected areas. Unfortunately, there are still diseases that can't be prevented medically, as can be seen in the recent outbreak of the Ebola virus in Africa. The Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says basic methods such as washing hands thoroughly, eating cooked food, wearing long sleeves, and staying away from animals give travelers the best chance of avoiding getting sick. Kwon So-hwa, ARIRANG News.
Pope Francis is coming to Korea in a week's time, and just in time for his visit, Patriot An Jung-geun's very last writing back in 1910 will be open to public here in Korea. Our Im Yoon-hee tells us more.
A heroic character in Korean history, Han Jung-geun sacrificed for the whole country when he took the life of the then Resident General of Korea, Ito Hirobumi. But what some don't know is that An also had an artistic side to him. seen in this sign preserved through the years. It's one of his last works, created while in prison, and reveals his devout Catholic faith, which he held onto until the very end. With the words "Respect of Heaven" written in traditional Hanja writing, An also wrote his name and left a handprint that's easily distinguished by his half-missing ring finger.
An Jung-gun was given the death sentence on February 15th, but before that, many Japanese individuals went to An, requesting various different writings and signs.
And that's how this particular sign came to be. It was originally in the possession of a prison warden. It found its way into the warden's son's hands and was then returned to Korea from Japan.
An Jung-gun wanted more than anything to have peace in Asia, but he also always followed his faith, so this is actually a happy event.
Last March, the sign failed to sell at an auction, but recently the Seoul Jamwon Catholic Church bought it and then donated the piece to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Seoul. And now it's being put on display in hopes of catching the attention of a very special upcoming visitor.
When the Pope visits this time, along with the beatification ceremony, An Jung-gun's life will hopefully be recognized and become a light for others.
The sign will be on display at the Seoul Museum of History, and will be available for viewing just in time for Pope Francis. Im Yoon-hee, ARIRANG News.
The World Health Organization is convening an emergency summit to determine whether this latest outbreak of Ebola has become an international health crisis. For more, Paul E. is joining us from the News Center. Paul, this fatal disease has already claimed the lives of some 900 people in West Africa, and concerns are growing this virus may spread to other parts of the world.
That's right, Charity. Health experts around the world are putting their heads together to get the Ebola outbreak under control. Officials from the WHO say the emergency meeting in Geneva is aimed at quelling fears and introducing concrete measures to tackle the epidemic. But already we're seeing countries such as Korea stepping up monitoring of its citizens abroad for possible infections, while Spain announced on this Wednesday that it was repatriating a missionary who tested positive for the disease in Liberia. Our Kim Min-ji reports.
The World Health Organization is set to discuss whether to designate this latest Ebola outbreak as a public health emergency of international concern. If the verdict after a two-day emergency committee meeting starting Wednesday is yes, the committee will recommend that the Director General of the WHO declare it as such. The UN body would then implement temporary measures to keep the virus from spreading internationally. The health organization says more than 1,600 people have been infected in the current outbreak and that the number killed is nearing 900. But there are fears that the actual death toll could be much higher than the WHO figures suggest. Voices among the world's leading Ebola specialists are calling on the WHO to make experimental drugs available to victims in West Africa. 2 American citizens who were flown home after being infected with the virus are reportedly recovering after being administered with an experimental drug called ZMapp. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
And over in the Gaza Strip, a 72-hour truce that went into effect on Tuesday has continued to hold up this time as thousands of Palestinians return to their homes in this region. Paul, this pause comes as the death toll reached nearly 1,900 lives, most of them as civilians and children. What's the situation like in the streets of Gaza at this point?
Well, daily commerce has cautiously begun to pick up while crews are trying to repair the heavily damaged power and communication infrastructure amid fears a truce may collapse at any time. Israel has withdrawn all its ground forces in Gaza, and Hamas militants have reportedly stopped all cross-border rocket fire. This as Israeli and Palestinian delegates are set to talk in Egypt in an attempt to make a more permanent solution. Our Connie Lee has this report.
The gunfire has gone silent in the Gaza Strip as the 72-hour ceasefire continues. But the clock is ticking. With the truce set to expire Friday morning, Israeli and Palestinian officials have been sent to Cairo for talks, with Egypt acting as mediator. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, speaking to the BBC, urged both sides to negotiate a two-state solution. Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, the 3-day ceasefire is a brief window of opportunity for the residents to take in the devastation, stock up on supplies, and recover their dead.
We found destruction everywhere. A mosque, Quran books, decomposed children were found under the rubble after 5 days. Public buildings that used to serve people were destroyed.
UNICEF, the children's body of the United Nations, says more than 400 Palestinian children have been killed since the beginning of the conflict, with more than 140 schools damaged or destroyed in less than a month. Along with the truce, Israel said it has withdrawn all of its ground forces, but according to a military spokesperson, the troops are still on the border, ready in defensive positions.
We are taking a defensive stand. We are there in order to prevent further infiltration and further attacks from Gaza, originating from Gaza.
About a quarter of Gaza's population is now displaced, and more than 1,900 Palestinians have been killed in the month-long conflict. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
And turning now to China, Paul, where authorities have launched an investigation into allegations that a Canadian couple stole military secrets threatening national security. Give us the details on this case.
Well, Beijing's foreign ministry announced on Tuesday that Kevin Garrett and his wife Julia Dawn Garrett were under investigation by the State Security Bureau. However, their current whereabouts are unknown. According to Xinhua News Agency, the Canadian couple is being suspected of collecting and stealing intelligence on Chinese military targets and key national defense research programs. Neither the foreign ministry nor Xinhua clarified if the couple had been detained, although the government has notified the Canadian embassy that the couple's rights have been, quote, fully guaranteed. The Vancouver couple had reportedly been living in China since 1984, working as English teachers before eventually opening a coffee shop in northwestern city of Dandong. Amid the spying allegations, experts are pointing to a Christian prayer and training center said to be operated by the Garretts, which was frequented by North Koreans returning home. They say their overtly religious activities along the North Korean border may have raised objections from officials in Pyongyang, where religion is banned and missionary work draws severe punishment.
I see. Now, finally, police in the U.S. have arrested a convicted sex offender after Google tipped off authorities there that he had child pornography on his computer. Out of millions of people who use Google, including you and me, how exactly were they able to catch this guy?
Well, police in Houston, Texas said the online search giant had notified the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children after detecting explicit pictures of a young girl sent in an email by Henry Skrillen through his Gmail account. The 41-year-old man has since been charged with possession of and promoting child pornography. U.S. federal law requires entities to report child exploitation when it's spotted, but this development is raising privacy concerns. Google defended its policy of electronically monitoring its users for child sexual abuse. It explained that special technology is used to attach a digital fingerprint to and identify images such as children. Google said it's a common practice among internet companies and that no other criminal activity is targeted with this technology. Charity?
All right, thank you very much for that update. Always good to have you with us, and we'll see you back here in just about 2 hours.
Good evening, I'm Michelle Park here with the lamest weather forecast. Now, we've been having on and off showers across the nation today. However, it looks like it'll continue tomorrow in the central region and Chungcheongnam-do province. Now, another evening of sweltering conditions coupled with high levels of humidity is in store, while heat wave advisories stay in place, meaning a long tropical night for regions down south. And tomorrow is Maibok here in Korea, which is traditionally the last of the hottest days of the summer. But it looks like this year we're going to have a cooler one due to the continuous rain. Now, besides that, Typhoon Halong is slowly making its way towards Okinawa, and it's expected to pass near the southern regions of Japan before tracking west, bringing strong winds and heavy rains to the Korea's southern regions by this weekend. Now, going over to our temperature readings. Seoul will top out the Thursday morning at 23 before reaching up to 30 degrees in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will both top out to 29 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island will top out at 30, while Dokdo hits 24, while Mangungang tops to 27. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that wraps it up for this edition of ARIRANG News. Thanks for watching.